new study out today says the true cost of living has gotten so high, half of the families in the 5 boroughs do not have enough income to make ends meet. They need some kind of assistance.
Well, that explains why people are leaving, but what's going to happen when everybody who's not rich vanishes from New York City? And why is it that nobody who's in charge here seems to care?
New Yorkers are feeling less positive, not very safe, and unsatisfied with most city services.
Costs in New York City have increased 131%.
What are you going to do, not eat, not pay your rent?
We make decent salary, but it's still not enough to survive in New York City.
Half of all city households don't make enough money to meet the minimum cost of living in New York City.
The middle class is leaving the city of New York. What we find with the people that we work with is that they're making tough choices between food and medicine.
Just 37% of New Yorkers felt safe in their neighborhoods, down from 50% in 2017. And only 11% feel the government is spending tax dollars wisely.
All those things that New Yorkers believe that are important, the report says that we are on the right track. The goal is to continue on that right track.
So 78,000 fewer people now reside in New York City. And this is not a one-off. It's been happening for the last 5 years. And what nobody's talking about is that if this trend continues, New York will be a city for the very rich and then whoever's still here. Which means New York could be headed for a dystopian contrast between the ultra-wealthy who can live wherever they want and the destitute who cannot afford to leave. And even though that might lead to a city that can't function properly, nobody in charge seems to mind that it's happening. Which means they either don't know it's happening or they benefit from it in some way. But before we get into what this means for the future of New York, it's important to understand that the problem of people leaving doesn't just affect wealthy areas like Manhattan. And that's because even the city's most affordable parts of town are no longer places everyday people can afford to live.
About this earlier in the week, that New York City is losing some folks, right? Some residents. But it turns out that New York State is also seeing the population drop.
Yeah, according to the Census Bureau, New York lost 102,000 people, by far the most of any state. California.
Wow, okay, so it's not just the city that's losing residents, which means it's not just New York City that's got an affordability problem, it's the entire state. And if somebody can't afford to live in the city itself and they get displaced, they're probably leaving the state altogether. And look at this. These are the top 10 counties with population loss nationwide last year. Look at all the New Yorks you see in there. That's crazy. And the Bronx alone lost 2% of its population in 2023. And the Bronx is New York City's most affordable borough, considerably cheaper than where we are now in Midtown Manhattan. But the people living in these tiny luxury box apartments, they're rich. So rich, in fact, that the cost of living in New York, which has increased drastically, doesn't bother them.
The reason behind a true cost of living report that found costs in New York City have increased 131%, while median...
Wow, a 131% cost of living increase. Nobody gets a 131% raise unless you're super rich, which is why only the rich can afford to stay here. And wages are just not keeping up with the costs of making it in New York. Even jobs that would require a degree, it's still not enough for people to afford what it takes to live here. And this isn't just because the price of apartments is absolutely insane. No, there are other reasons why people are packing it up and calling it quits that have nothing to do with the rent. $6.99.
Many New Yorkers are struggling to afford basic needs as they deal with the rising cost of housing.
Half of all city households don't make enough money to meet the minimum cost of living in New York City, and nearly 80% of households are considered housing burden, which means more than 30.
Okay, so it's not just that you have to make $100,000 to live here and be able to afford food. The real issue is that most jobs in New York City don't pay that, and certainly not everybody that works here is a millionaire, and that has a lot to do with why so many people are calling it quits. On top of that, 8 million Americans are living paycheck to paycheck, and what that means is even a high income isn't enough to keep you in a place like New York forever. And the first reason New York City is shrinking is because who wants to work that hard for so little? Just to essentially be living paycheck to paycheck. It's like a gigantic hamster wheel. Once you get off, you're done. And think about what you sacrificed to live as if you had absolutely nothing in a tiny little apartment. In fact, one study suggests people making $100K feel like they're only making about 36. And that's after taxes are factored in, which makes shopping, even at a place like Target, something that is almost unaffordable for the vast majority of people. On top of that, groceries in New York cost more than they do in other places because of all the extra costs associated with doing business in a place like New York. And of course, the shoplifting and crime epidemic here also affects prices. There are more products locked up in jail than there are criminals in this city. But before we get into where this unaffordability crisis is taking the city, it's important to understand that it's the city's fault that it's happening, and it might only get worse. And that's because New Yorkers pay more taxes than anybody else, which means not only does it cost an arm and a leg to stay here, after you get paid, the government takes the other arm or the other leg. And this is what we have to show for it: peel and paint. And it comes out to about an extra $12,000 per person on average for the best infrastructure in the whole world. And that's because New Yorkers don't just pay state income tax and federal income tax, they also pay something called city tax. And the sales tax here is higher as well whenever you buy candy, soda, or pretty much anything. But in spite of that, our transit system is as old as the Stone Age, the streets are full of crime, and the National Guard was even recently deployed to subway stations just like this one. But we can't afford for them to be here all day, so they leave stations like this after about an hour and a half every morning. But if you think all that sounds terrible, wait until you hear what it costs to live in a tiny apartment. Because not only were price records set a year ago, this year things are going to be even worse. Towers, most affordable luxury building in Midtown. Studio apartment, over $3,000 a month. And you gotta ask yourself, who thinks coming here and renting one of these is a good idea? They're all gonna rent too. But compared to the average US home, which is over 2,000 square feet, this ain't nothing. In fact, living in a New York City apartment, it's like living in a little box. You don't have a lot of space, and for that reason, most places, they lease, and then 2 to 3 years later, they're back on the market, if they even make it past the first year. People move out fast. And you've got to ask yourself, how sustainable is it for New York to be a place where you have transient tenancy in most of the buildings? You don't have people who are staying here for 10, 20, 30 years after they get a place. And what that means is these apartments only rent because they support some other activity or some other purpose. And once that activity or purpose dries up, the person who was living there moves out. And the scary thing is that even if you're able to afford New York City today, there's no guarantee that's going to be the case tomorrow.
Median earnings went up just 71%. 36% of households lacked enough income for basic needs just 3 years ago.
Okay, so incomes have gone up 71%, which seems pretty good. But again, that's only about half of the 131% cost of living that we're all facing right now. Even if your income went up 100%, you still wouldn't be able to afford New York. And that's why people are struggling, working separate jobs, becoming part of the gig economy just to try and scrape by. But that brings up a very uncomfortable question. If normal people can't live here and the rich are the only ones who can afford to stay, what is that going to turn the city into? Where is it headed, and what's it going to look like? So the problem with people leaving the city is that the city looks at all of us as if we have a dollar sign on the top of our head. And when we leave, that dollar sign disappears, and so does the amount of money the city has access to by way of people and businesses. Every time you buy something, the city gets paid. And every time you get paid, the city gets paid. Businesses pay massive fees for licenses and things needed just to exist. And that's why you'd think that people leaving would be something that more of our elected leaders would be concerned with, unless they have some other plan that we don't know about.
What a conundrum for a middle-class New Yorker to be in. Erasmo's a paralegal, his wife a supervisor.
We make decent salary, but it's still not enough to survive in New York City.
They're considering moving with their 3 kids to Tennessee.
So one of the big problems for the city is that if people are leaving and those people have families, like let's say my family leaves, my kids aren't going to live here and pay taxes in the future. And all the money I had to spend raising them was spent somewhere else, which means the city is replacing its future stable tax base with a transient one. Long term, that's very unstable because it means the only people here can leave at the drop of a hat. And for an economy to survive sudden shocks, you can't have a population vacation, they can just pack all their stuff up, throw it in a van, and skip town. And that brings us to another crisis caused by population loss, which isn't going anywhere anytime soon. And that has to do with the idea of New York entering what is called an urban doom loop. And this is also caused by population loss, but not necessarily in the ways that people think. So that right there is a little apartment building, but then over here you have offices. And think about it, if people move out of the city, they're not going to use those offices anymore, are they? And that's exactly what's happening. Even the cheapest commercial real estate's sitting empty right now. In fact, the city has almost 100 million square feet of vacant office space. And just like every person in the city has a dollar sign above their head, every office building has dollar signs above it as well. And that's because the city makes millions of dollars in property taxes. And offices only have value if they're being used for something. If they're for rent, sitting empty, their value goes down. And if even massive chains like Panera Bread can't make it in Midtown and they move out, it could take the landlord years to secure another tenant. Companies just don't need to use the space like they used to, and therefore they sit empty like this space. Well, if that happens and the value of commercial real estate drops, the city is going to earn less money from its property taxes. And if the city has less money to run itself, what do you think its options are? Well, the first problem is that they're both bad. Either cut taxes or reduce spending. Now, if the city cuts spending, we're going to see more of New York's deterioration like we have over the last year, with police having budgeting issues with sanitation as they were forced to cut their budget. But who wants to live in a place with overflowing trash and crime that is just skyrocketing through the roof because there aren't enough police to keep everyone safe? On top of that, less money means less help for needy New Yorkers, increasing homelessness. So that's what happens when the city makes cuts. The place gets worse. But the opposite happens if they go with option number 2, which is to raise taxes. Then things could stay as they are now, which isn't exactly great. And the place continues to get progressively more expensive, forcing people to leave as well. And this is why it's called a doom loop, because once people start leaving, there's really no way to stop it with either of these options. And what's most frustrating about this is the city's problems are definitely the case of mismanagement, along with way too many rules for what you can and can't do with these buildings. You're at home watching this thinking to yourself, gee, how can the city have a housing crisis and an empty office crisis? Why don't they just use one of these crises to fix the other? Well, the city's trying to. And it's recently come out that more than 45 office buildings are going to become apartments. But even though that sounds like a lot of new apartments, it really isn't. And that's because the 45 offices that will become apartments, it's only going to add about 22,000 units. But the total office sector is about 5 Empire State Buildings worth of empty office space, and 45 buildings isn't making a dent in that number. And the other problem is urban planners have realized the city is short about 500,000 apartments over the next 10 years. And those aren't needed to make everyone's life better. No, the 500,000 apartment figure is just going to help the city keep pace with its own population growth, which means even if they succeed in that monumental goal, things are going to be exactly the way they are in 10 years as they are right now. And part of the problem is that even though offices might look like apartments, the process of turning them into apartments is incredibly expensive. So much so that experts think it's better to just leave places empty for the most part, as once they become apartments and people start living there, they can never go back. And the income they'd gain from making these conversions doesn't justify their cost right now. The other problem is that the units that come out of these office to apartment conversions, most of the time they're luxury apartments because we're in a housing crisis and these builders want to make money. And let's be real, 45 buildings full of luxury apartments, that's not going to help people who are at Target making tough choices on a weekly basis. We need affordable apartments, not luxury apartments. But believe it or not, there are some common sense ways that New York could clean itself up quickly. The only problem is that they're so practical, I don't think anybody in charge has thought of them yet.
Are feeling less positive, not very safe. The nonprofit, which interviewed 6,600 households across the city, found 30% of New Yorkers rate quality of life as excellent or good.
Okay, pretty big survey, 6,600 households, not a small sample size by any means. And people are upset with city services and safety. And here's why that's ridiculous. Look at this city budget. Only 4% of it is spent on public safety. Look at that. Now, to be honest, that seems a little low for a city of 8 million people, especially while it's going through a crime wave. Also, 31% of the budget spent on education, 26% is spent on health. And while those are important things to spend money on, if we could find find a little bit of wiggle room in there to maybe hire some extra police, that would do a lot to help bring crime down because there aren't enough police. And even though city officials say crime is down, an investigation has revealed that they may actually be underreporting the amounts of crime because officers in the field aren't necessarily recording every single interaction they have and reporting it. But here's what is getting recorded.
Passengers terrified, trapped in a moving subway with nowhere to go as gunshots rang out. This chilling video, 4.5 minutes long. 4.5 minutes of fear. Passengers hiding under the seats, hugging one another, not knowing what the outcome would be.
When I see the shooting,
that is absolutely terrifying. And the reason that it happened is because there aren't enough police to ride the subway cars and put a stop to these things. In fact, we don't even have the money right now to have police at every single subway station. And there's only 472 of them. That might sound like a lot, but with 1,300 more police officers hired, you could put 3 people at every subway station. But that would require finding money in the city's bloated budget. And on top of that, the current force's morale is very low. Many officers see their work basically go unrewarded because so many criminals get released and are back out on the street after getting arrested. And what that could mean is New York City is a mess, not necessarily because of lack of police, but because of progressive justice systems that don't punish the guilty. But there's another thing the city could start doing immediately that would probably make a big difference.
And only 11% feel the government is spending tax dollars wisely, compared to 21% 6 years ago.
Okay, so people don't feel like the government is looking out for them. They feel like it's wasting their money. But you know something? Only 4% of the budget gets spent on transportation. And if you wanted to make an immediate difference in the way the city looked and felt, you could start by cleaning up the subway, and it's not going to cost that much. New Yorkers don't necessarily need a brand new subway system, but they do need one that's reliable and where the trains are running on time and they aren't dangerous. And as we've already seen, the government has deployed the National Guard to the subways. People now report feeling safer when they see the uniformed officers. And if you were to combine that, a presence that is perpetual of uniformed officers, with trains that run on time and aren't unnecessarily delayed pretty much all the time, people would feel better about using the city. They would be happier. They would spontaneously decide to use the trains more often than they do. Now, people don't even want to use them. Look, many subway lines, you've got a 25% chance of not getting your train on time. And that's insane when you realize that the subway and the people running it have a $20 billion annual budget. And when you think about what an obnoxiously expensive city New York is, it makes sense that improving things like safety and adding low-cost transportation options would greatly benefit everybody pretty much right away. But what do you think the city could do to stop its population from vanishing? Are my ideas any good? Let me know what yours are. I appreciate you watching. I'll see you in the next video.